Por otro lado, Adnan fue copresidente de la comisión de LSE y Oxford sobre fragilidad, crecimiento y desarrollo de los estados. Continuó abocado al tema de los estados frágiles a través de la posterior iniciativa para la reducción de la fragilidad de los estados. Ha publicado escritos en revistas profesionales sobre temas muy diversos, entre ellos cómo promover la mejor relación precio-calidad en compras y contrataciones públicas, cómo optimizar el sector público motivando a los funcionarios para mejorar su desempeño y cómo fomentar la iniciativa empresarial y la protección social. En este seminario vamos a conversar acerca de lecciones aprendidas en el uso de evidencia para lograr políticas públicas más efectivas. I'm very interested in listening to your perspective. So, Professor, all the floor is yours. So we're having this 35-40-minute presentation, and then we leave questions at the end. Si no se sienten cómodos haciendo las preguntas en inglés, you can do them in Spanish. Las pueden hacer en castellano y yo las traduzco con el profesor. Que nadie se quede, por favor, con una pregunta sin responder. So I'm going to translate if there's any question.
Muchas gracias por invitarme. Mi español, hablo un poco de español, pero mi español es más peor que ustedes, así que cambio en inglés. So it's a pleasure and honor to be here. Let me stand. Okay, so I'm going to talk about policy and use of evidence in policy. And what do I mean by that? So there is a normal, call it linear perspective, a more technocratic view of policy. We economists, social scientists, or others, we design policy and then policymakers implement it. That's a linear, simple view, and I'm going to challenge that. Reality is far more complicated than that. A, we don't know all the answers. We need to work with the policymakers. And B, use of evidence is not just supply driven. There is also the demand side of evidence. Why and when do policymakers need evidence? What kind of evidence do they need? And how do we support them in what they need? And why do they not use evidence even when sometimes it is beneficial for them? It could be used effectively for policy. So one thing, like my starting point is, everything that you're learning in your classes on economics, political science, and others is useful. So use of evidence for policy making is a lot about using your toolkits, using theory and data for designing the right policies. So I'm going to talk about it. I'm also going to talk about a little bit about the demand side, about barriers to using evidence. And then I'm going to talk about use of evidence is not just a one-shot transaction at one point in time. It is a process of continuous, active learning. And I'm going to explain it in a minute. So for good policies, it's not just important to get policies right, to design the right policies, to get prices right, as economists say. In other words, incentives right. It's also important to think about state capacity. How does the state develop its capacity to be able to design and correct policies going forward? So that's what I'm going to talk about. So what do I mean by continuous active learning? By that I mean like policy making is not just a one-shot transaction. What it means is designing policies based on the best information that we have, best evidence that we have now, and then testing that knowledge, getting new information, and updating them. So in the words of Mansky, described in Charles Mansky, who is a policy maker, who is a top economist working on policy, I would describe this as act now based on the best information, the best evidence that we have on what we know, but also take actions to speed up learning, to learn about whether that policy course is going to be effective or not, to generate more knowledge, and then update our policy actions based on that knowledge. I would call that the principle of continuous active learning. a virtuous policy cycle. Even if we don't get the policy right in the first instance, it's not a one-shot transaction. It's a process of any policymaker or any policy process can make errors and mistakes. We in UK also make mistakes. Others also, like it's not like any political environment can make mistakes. So the key test is there an error correction mechanism? How quickly, how effectively can we correct for errors and update policies? And if I were to share three big principles, at least that I have learned I work both in policy as well as research. So those will be do diagnostics, identify the problem using the economic and political science theory and data to identify the problem that we have, diagnose the root cause of the problem. In other words, start with diagnosis rather than assuming the problem that we have. Start with diagnosis, context-specific diagnosis. That's what we were discussing earlier. Yes, those summaries of evidence from elsewhere are important. What worked in Brazil is important. It's a good starting point, but it's not a good ending point. We need context-specific, rigorous evidence, diagnostic on what works in this particular context. And then it's a question of like, policy making or good policy making is never a one-shot transaction. It is a process. It's not an event. Once you design good policies and then it's over. It's a process of continuous adaptation, error correction, adaptation, course correction. And every time we adopt good policies, we discover new problems. And because we economists know that people respond behaviorally, so it's not that we change the tax rate and people will automatically comply. People will respond, so people respond to incentives and there's a behavioral response to how people will take policy. And we need to incorporate that behavioral response in our policy design and updation process. And lastly, good policy and good use of evidence is not just about technocratic knowledge. It's also deeply political. So political not just in the big politics sense, but also political in the sense of who are the stakeholders for that policy change, what are their interests, are their interests compatible with the policy or not? In other words, is the policy incentive compatible or not? Will those stakeholders who will engage with policy find it in their interest to comply with that policy, to adapt that policy or not? If not, we need to go back to the drawing board, redesign our policies, and think of incentive compatibility in a serious way. In other words, it's not just, good policy making is not just a technical challenge, it's also a political challenge, it's also a question of incentives. I'll give you a few examples of how this works out, at least like a few very quick examples. In fact, 3 examples. My first example will come from India, environmental pollution. And it's a question of how do we discover what the root cause of the problem is? And can we design better policy between researchers and policymakers? And how do we know whether it actually works? The best of policies can also fail. How do we know it works? My second example will come from public procurement. So you look into public procurement everywhere around the world, it always says value for money. Making good procurement, in other words, finding goods at the cheapest price, which are the same quality. Quality adjusted, lowest price paid for the goods. The problem is it's very hard to measure value for money. Yeah? So ultimately, many systems, bureaucratic systems, not just in developing countries, but also, especially US is a prime example, end up measuring public procurement by were the rules followed or not. Legal compliance. Now, legal compliance is very different from whether it was a good procurement or not. Okay? Were there 3 courts in the system? usual requirement for procurement in many systems, or were the rules followed or not is very, very different. And I'll give you one example of that. The third example is, for any policy to work, citizens or those who are affected by policy need to respond and comply with policy. How do we have voluntary compliance by citizens? And my understanding of Argentina, and I could be wrong, this is just my second visit, and that is Argentina has massive potential, but it's also like stuck in a, call it like a multiple equilibria, low-level equilibrium, a trap from which to a higher level equilibrium of higher growth is possible. But a lot of discussion is stuck in short-term distributional struggle over a shrinking pie, and not about how to increase the size of the pie, not zero-sum gain, but how to increase the size of the pie so that everyone benefits. And that's a deeply, call it like an agenda for which like citizens need to comply. Citizens and different actors need to comply. I'll give one example, not from Argentina, from my own work. So, you know, like every time you come to a presentation, there is a grand old academic tradition. No presentation can go without the presenter showing their own work. I'll spare you for the first example, which is not my work, but you know what is coming. So the next examples will be my work. But those are just examples. So my first example is environmental pollution, but forget the context, but think of the principles. So environmental pollution is huge in India. This data is from a few years old. Now it's massive, massive in all parts of India. One of the most polluted places on earth. Reduces like average life spans by 2 to 3 years for every citizen. So just imagine like how many years of life are wasted on due to environmental pollution. And this was recognized by the system long time ago. And the system design, in fact, the courts force the Pollution Control Board to establish a system of third-party audits whereby each industry and each factory need to get their pollution level checked by an independent body. And if they fail, then there need to be compliance. These darker places are more polluted places. This is a few years old. Now there is massive, the numbers have even gone much further. So based on the reported data from what the firms reported, what the third-party audit reported in terms of the pollution levels, this is where we are. So this is a histogram. This is the levels of pollution. This red line is the national environmental standard. Ideally, no firm should go beyond this. And this is within 10%. You see 73% of the firms are within the national, within 10% of the national standard. If you look into this data, what would you conclude? The system is working. The system of environmental pollution, third-party audits is working. Yes, there are a few big polluters, but most of the firms are staying within the national standard. Okay? And now what they did, this was done by a group of researchers, Rohini Pandey, Esther Duflo, who won the Nobel Prize, Michael Greenstone from Chicago, and others. So they sent, what they did was within 2 weeks of what the third party reported, they sent another team, an independent team, to back check the pollution levels. And this is what they find. This is what is reported, and this is what they find. Okay? Is the system working? System is definitely not working. There are firms which are polluting up to 4 times the national average. The true measure of firms within 10% is 19% rather than 73%. And you can see that this is also failing on both dimensions. There are also good guys here who are polluting far less, but they are not being acknowledged. Okay? And you can also see, like, you're economist, you're studying public policy, you can also see the potential for exchange here. In a system with a pollution exchange, you could have a trading system where these good guys could also trade. In other words, how do you control for this? A, what is the conclusion here? The system is not working. The system is corrupt. Okay? One. The two is, if the system was working, there's a big problem, but there are also potential solutions. One of the solutions could be do more effective regulation, tighten up the system. The other could be a market system. The market system would be, there are good guys who are polluting far less, there are bad guys who are polluting far more. Have a system of trading where good guys can do the trading for their pollution to the bad guys. That's also being tried, pollution permits. That's a market-determined solution. But the first order thing is, there is a problem here. Okay? Data, good data tells us, good, credible data tells us there is a problem. What is the root cause of the problem? That's what theory tells us. Theory tells us that the root cause of the problem is agency problem, what we call public principal agent problem. Under the existing system, firms pay the auditors to test. And if you find this incredible, that's exactly the same system that we also apply for instance, like accounting for private sector firm. We use the same system in many, many other areas also. How do you control for that? Again, theory tells us, in this case, they work with the policymakers to design a system to address this principal agent problem, agency problem. And they had these 4 elements of that solution. So rather than I, as a policy factory owner, choosing which auditor to go for, so the system randomly allocates auditors to firms. They get a fixed payment rather than I pay you less because you make a report in your office and you give me a fake report. There was monitoring of auditors also. They were told that they will also be monitored. And if you do a good job, you'll get a bonus payment. So their incentives were also taken care of. And then they applied an experiment to see whether it worked or not. This was a randomized controlled trial. So some firms were randomly. And then you can imagine like it worked basically. Yes, there was still some pollution, but basically it worked. And they also did back checks on the treatment, and they found that basically it worked. It's a paper, if you're interested, 2013 paper, auditing the auditors in QJE. So the big message here is, why it worked? It was also incentive compatible. In this case, there was a huge civil society activism. The High Court had determined that you need to fix the system. In this case, the political system was not that responsive initially, but civil society, judicial activism, the Pollution Control Board was itself very active, and they implemented all of the findings of this, took that to scale, because it was clear that it will help them. So it was incentive compatible for all the players, and it worked. I'm not saying it will work for every single case. I'm just using it as an example. So in other words, use of theory and data to identify the root cause of the problem, a joint design, testing it whether it works or not, thinking about incentive compatibility, and taking it to scale. That's one way to use evidence for policy. Here is another example. So again, I told you I'll come to. So this is from, I told you, public procurement. One way of measuring whether public procurement works is, were the rules followed or not? That's a legal compliance. The other way is looking into data to see whether everyone is doing efficient procurement or not. This is from my work from my colleague Oriana Bandiera and Andrea Pratt and Lati in Italy. They look into, among many other things, paper, A4 paper, and they look into the price paid for the same paper by different public bodies, and you can see, you don't need to look at the numbers. Some people are paying 2 to 3 times what other people are doing. We repeated with the same co-authors. We did it in a field experiment in Pakistan, and we find similar. Large variation in prices, A4 paper, and you could say some of it could be, some are buying like better quality, 80 gram per square meter versus 70 or others. Some are buying in bulk or others. We control for all of those attributes, and these orange lines are controlling for all of those things. And yes, some of that variation is reduced, but still there is a big variation. even for something as standard as paper, exactly the same paper, controlling for quantity, different public bodies are paying this very different prices for that. Think of the similar thing for how much variation will be, and we did it for many, many, many goods, computers, stationery, many other generic goods also. So A, it establishes there is a problem. So data and a way of measuring that tells us there is a problem. What we did then next was working with the government at a large scale, 4 different ministries. We were, now that we have a way of measuring, objectively measuring value for money, we then try to address the agency problem. So the agency problem of procurement officers about should we give them more incentives, align their incentives to better procurement by giving them financial bonuses. If you do better procurement, so at the end of the year, it will be measured by an independent body through these objective measures. And if you do a good job, you'll be given financial bonuses. Versus, you will be given more autonomy. In other words, right now the system, at least in this context, was you cannot do any procurement without first getting approval from an auditor. And now, you know the old problem, who will guard the guardians? Then it becomes a problem of who is more efficient or more corrupt. Is it the frontline procurement officer or the auditor? If it is the more corrupt guy, most of the rules around the world are based on the principle, it's the frontline guys who are more corrupt, let's tie their hands. Give more, but tying their hands means more rules and giving more authority to the supervisor. But what if the supervisor or the auditor was more corrupt? Then giving more authority to a supervisor will worsen outcome. That's what we discover. So what we discover is, so on the horizontal axis, forget about this. This is a measure of how corrupt or inefficient the supervisor is. The supervisor in this case is called the accountant general, but forget about it. It's the auditor, how aligned or misaligned the supervisor is. And they vary. Some are more aligned. It was a huge state, thousands of people. So some are more aligned or some are less aligned. How we measure this, I can tell you, but like for the purpose of today, if that's a question, I'm happy to tell you. But otherwise, like here is the degree of more aligned to less aligned, less corrupt to more corrupt. So that's the dimension. And whether our treatment work in reducing prices or not. If you reduce prices below 0, that's good procurement. For the same quality, you're reducing prices. That's what we want. Okay? And we find a huge heterogeneity, 3 regions. When the auditor is, or supervisor is more honest, okay, then both autonomy and incentives work. In fact, incentives work better. Incentives work better when the supervisor is more honest. He or she gives you more space for in other words, like incentives can work in an environment where you have the authority to do something. However, and the supervisor is aligned with you. The supervisor allows you to take good decisions. In the middle region means where the middle region is defined as by how corrupt or inefficient the supervisor is. Both treatments roughly work, but when the supervisor becomes more corrupt or inefficient, the incentives treatment doesn't work at all, has no effect. When the supervisor is dishonest, there's not much that the frontline agent can do, but the autonomy treatment has huge effect. Autonomy reduces prices by a big margin. In other words, giving more control from a dishonest or a corrupt supervisor to a less corrupt frontline agent improves things. Okay? Overall effect is there are far more corrupt supervisors. The overall effect is like this. The overall effect is autonomy treatment works. The incentive treatment doesn't work. Now think of any public reform, procurement reform around the world that you will see. It is mostly designed on let's have more rules. Let's give more authority to supervisors. I am not saying this will be true for every case. In Argentina, it could be reversed. But at least it gives you a pause for thought. What if the rules were to worsen outcomes? What if the cure was worse than the disease? Okay? It gives you a pause for thought. Again, this is a published paper in QJE, and again, there are policy papers around it, like in case you're interested. My third and last example, then how I'm doing for time? Perfect, okay, good. Okay, good. Is about citizen compliance. So, and the example I'm using is taxation, but you could use that example for anything. If Argentina has to take difficult economic decisions that have short-run cost, long-run benefits, it's the same question. Like, how will citizens comply is a deep question. So, in this question, I think one challenge and puzzle on taxation is, if you compare tax revenues, how much countries around the world collect as taxation as a share of GDP, and the tax rate that they have. The tax rate between developing and developed countries, this is 10% of GDP, which is developing countries, and this is roughly 40% of GDP, which is what OECD countries and richer countries collect. So the maximum income tax rate doesn't vary much between developing and developed countries. This is the top tax rate. However, the share of taxes varies by 1 to 4. So it's not about tax rates. And mostly it's also not about tax instruments. Most of the countries use the same tax instrument, VAT, value-added tax, income tax. It's primarily about how effectively they use these instruments. It's primarily about these things. So my colleague, Tim Besley at LSE, he says like taxation is one of the key measures of whether we have an effective state or not, whether a state can go from 10% to 40%, because it's not about revenue alone. Because in the process of like raising that revenue, you have to be more accountable to citizens. You have to have systems of accountability, checks and balances also. So that's what like a more effective state means. But it's primarily, if it is not about rates and it's primarily not about tax instruments, so it is primarily about these two things. Enforcement, how good is the state in enforcing its taxes, and how good are the citizens in complying with those taxes. Margaret Levy, who's a political scientist at Berkeley, like she calls it quasi-voluntary compliance, by which she means, yes, it is about citizen compliance, but they also know that there is enforcement in the background. So the compliance that we get is equilibrium compliance. Citizens comply, but they also know that there is, if I don't comply, the state can also come after me. So good taxation in this way, but I would say all economic reforms are a lot about enforcement capacity of the state, but also voluntary compliance by citizens. So it's not just building a police state, a state which has a strict. The state has to have both a strict enforcement capacity, but also it needs, in this case, it needs to spend its money on things on the spending side and on other things that citizens want. In other words, like citizens have trust in the state. So trust is a key variable. I am much interested in trust, like that's a subject of much of my research also. And here is why trust matters. This again, these few graphs come from my colleague, Tim Besley. I teach a course with him, I run projects with him. So places where countries which have more trust in state institutions also have high state capacity. Okay? That's one. This is a correlation, not a causation, so but tells us something. But what does trust mean? So trust in states institutions is higher when there is voluntary compliance. Okay? So voluntary compliance is a big measure input into trust in the state. And now the next question is, where does voluntary compliance come from? So voluntary compliance or trust in state institutions is higher in places where there are more executive constraints, where there are more checks and balances on the state. Okay? So think of COVID-19. Many countries around the world were able to do like lockdown and other measures. Some countries were enforcing it purely with policing measures. Again, there's the research. Where those measures were more effective were where citizens were also voluntarily complying, and they were complying where there were higher trust in the state. So trust in the state is a key variable here. How do you build trust in the state? That's my last example. So again, working with colleagues, Asim Khwaja, Ben Olkan, MIT, and others. So we are working with the state in this case in linking the taxes that people pay with the services that they get. So in big cities, going from neighborhood, street to street level, asking each citizen, where would you want, in this case, this is property tax, council tax, where would you want your taxes to be spent? Okay, so street light, by road, whatever, like my water supply, very local public goods. And the state committing to do it on those goods, 1/3 of your taxes collected from a neighborhood to be spent exactly on the goods that the citizens of that street or neighborhood wanted to spend on. This is again a field experiment, so we have different forms of doing that. And we're getting at causal connection. And the idea is, it's not just about taxes. The idea is about how do we get this virtuous cycle. So if the state provides more public goods or services to the citizens, that will hopefully, that can lead to, and this is testable whether it actually leads to or not, higher citizen willingness to pay and more higher revenue collection. But even more important that is higher trust in the state. The state asks me and commits to doing it, and does it lead to more trust in the state? And don't look for this paper, it doesn't exist. So it's a commitment device in the language of economists, because we're currently writing it, so hopefully in 1 to 2 months, there'll be a paper out there. But we're already seeing an effect of those. So a credible commitment by the state can work in building trust in the state, is the bottom line message. So of this work. This is the state of services provided. And this is again in Pakistan. Yes. I'll end up with my day job. My current day job is I'm a chief economist at FCDO. FCDO is Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, UK Foreign Office and Development Office. Use of evidence is a huge, big part of our job. In fact, our permanent secretary called it, and rightly called it, it is an international economics department. So you look into any foreign policy challenge, you'll see economics and political economy like at the heart of it. So we consider our ministry to be an international economics department. So I and wonderful colleagues here who are sitting here, we have like 400 to 500 economists around the organization. MACD works here, and then I also work with a team at the headquarters in London. Our goal is to provide analysis to feed into policy decisions. And some of that is global foreign policy issues. Some of that is about international development. As you may know, our ministry is a merger of 2 separate ministries. What used to be called DFID, Department for International Development, UK Aid. UK spends a huge amount of money, more than £10 billion every year on global development, mostly in Africa and Asia, but also the Foreign Office. So the FCDO results from the merger of both, and I'm seconded from the LSE, so I still have my presence at LSE, but like I mostly work at the Foreign Office. And use of this diagnostics and analysis, all of the things that I'm talking about, I'm not saying we are perfect. We are also like a work in progress, trying to do a better job. Many of people like from public policy schools go and work for our office. You'll also be working in your country, Argentina, or maybe other countries also. This is the type of work that you could be doing, where you could be applying your toolkits into this. How do we do this? On macro questions, for instance, My colleague Andres Velasco there, who is the dean of my school, so we use a lot of like growth diagnostic type of stuff to work into, to identify barriers and binding constraints to growth in different countries, especially countries that we also provide development on. We also work on original analysis, and by which I mean two things. We publish summaries of cost effectiveness of different projects. For instance, on education, what we call best buys. Maybe it's not a good name, but the idea is how do we compare different interventions done around the world on similar areas? For instance, in education, in reducing class size, using different textbooks, using digital. I'm just giving an example, but one could use it in any area. How do we use information to improve the effectiveness of democracy? That was our latest best buy. And the idea is like to give evidence on things that have worked around the world and things that not work. All of these is public. MACD hopefully can share the links. Those are in English. Hopefully we can also translate them in Spanish. But that's a public good commonly available. How we use this is again like, as I was sharing with colleagues earlier, is using evidence or what has worked in one context is a good entry point, is not a good ending point. What we also need is what will work in this context. So using context-specific analysis, using theory and data. You saw those examples, for instance, the pollution example. Where if that work in that context doesn't necessarily mean it will also be the same problem here. I showed you evidence from public procurement. In that context, it turned out that the supervisors were more corrupt and are inefficient than the frontline officers. Doesn't mean it will be true in Argentina. So using context-specific analysis and then using it is the right way to use these summaries. And then we fund a lot of research in other organizations. In fact, like FCDO is the largest funder for development impact evaluation around the world. So we both directly, but also through many different organizations. We fund the World Bank Development Impact Evaluation Program, JPOL, Poverty Action Lab, and many other interventions. We provide funding, some funding to them, International Growth Center, many others. And the idea is to extend the frontiers of knowledge, to see what is working, and even more important, from my time in policy, I've spent a lot of time in policy. I think getting good evidence on what is working, policies that work is important, but it is far more important to kill bad policies. Because usually like people are stuck. I can give many, many examples. Every country has an example. My Argentinian friends also tell me. But no country is immune to bad policies, including the country that I come from. Killing bad policies is really important, and evidence could play a part in shaping public narrative in terms of killing bad policies and providing an atmosphere conducive to adopting good policies. So this is what I started with, and I'm ending up with this one. Diagnostic use of theory and data is key for use of evidence. Policy is a process, not a one-shot transaction. It's not a moment, it's not a product. What we need is continuous active learning, but also think of capacity building, think of like system level interactions, not just one interaction, system level perspective. And lastly, power and agency politics, not just in the big politics sense, national level, provincial level, those are also important. But any reform that we are thinking about, who are the right stakeholders in that reform? What are their incentives? Will they comply with that reform or not? I gave you examples of, we designed rules, but it is not compatible with the incentives of we give the power to enforce those rules. You taking the example of public procurement, it may not be in their interest to enforce their rules. We design a system of third-party audit. You see the example of India. But if the incentives are not aligned, it will not work. So thinking of power and agency, thinking of not just technocratic, So sometimes we economists also think too highly of our, like, and we design technical solutions. Those are needed. Our theory and data is definitely needed. But combining that with a sensible political economy analysis, incentives, thinking deeply about incentives is also important. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Khan. I'm going to take some questions from the audience. Anyone wants to go ahead?
Not just questions, but comments and
Comments, questions.
your reflections, insights.
Pueden ser en castellano, si alguno se siente más cómodo en nuestra lengua materna y puedo hacer la traducción como pueda de los comentarios. Sí.
Hello, thank you very much. I have a comment and a question. My impression is that very often the government or there are no effective instruments or act practices by know of any case or any government that has imposed formal act.
Yeah, that's a very relevant and very good question. So, environments vary in terms of how conducive they are to evidence. If you compare around the world, I wouldn't say like any environment is perfect. But even in the best environment, you will find spaces, you'll find pockets of where people are willing to engage more with evidence. So people used to say the same for India. I showed you the example of like the pollution control. Under the right circumstances, they work with a group of researchers, they took it to scale. All the recommendations that came out from that analysis, A, they did this project with them, that research with them, and B, they adopted all the recommendations coming from it. Why? Because yes, there were a set of people who were there who were reform champions, but it was also incentive compatible. There was pressure. In that case, politics was not compatible, but there was pressure from civil society, there was judicial activism, civil society, and the agency itself also wanted to do it. So there are pockets here and there. All of my work is working with governments at large scale. So working with large tax authorities, and that work I haven't shown. Working with the tax authority in the entire state of more than 100 million people, and randomizing their pays. The state did acknowledge that. Why? Because there was an opening, people said, we have tried different things, but we don't know whether they worked or not. Yes, there was an opening, we could convince them. That also required a different way of engaging. It wasn't like take the data and run, like we engaged with them for several years, ran a pilot, engaged with them, and also tried to manage. I, in my previous capacity, I was the research director for International Growth Center, an LSE Oxford Joint Center, aimed at making research and policy partnerships in Asia and Africa. It didn't work everywhere, I'm very honest. But in some environments, and it doesn't always work, but in many environments, even in many countries in Asia and Africa, there were partnerships. What are the key lessons of that? One, it requires longer term collaboration rather than just a one-shot transaction. B, often what has worked is matching the horizons of the policymakers and researchers. Researchers, especially those who are doing experiment, but also non-experimental work. Often they come back, I can't go to a ministry and say, give me the data or work with me and I'll give you findings 4 years down the line. No policymaker that I know. Maybe central banks sometimes do, but rarely with a policymaker. I do need to give them to respect their incentives and to give them products in the short run. My tax projects, we analyze the data, we created dashboards, we created heat maps, we created other things which are, I call them secondary byproducts of research, which are less valuable. They will not get published in QJE, but they are valuable for policymakers. They care about those things. So finding those things. What I've also discovered is it is too costly for individual researcher to pay all the cost of that relationship. Maintaining a partnership with policy actors is costly. Like from what I'm saying, you need to give them a lot of, call it free consulting, call it secondary products, or call them free advice, whatever is valuable for them, in addition to your research. So also give them other things. And that can take a lot of time, especially junior researchers or others, like they need to publish, have their career concerns and tenure track and other things, which is very well, because the cost could be so high that I don't want to go there, like I have to do too many things. And what we have discovered, at least I've discovered, is having intermediary organizations that can bear some of those costs can reduce the cost for both sides, can reduce the transaction cost of both sides. For instance, like think of JPOL, think of International Growth Center had presence in about 15 countries. Like they could say, this researcher may or may not be there 10 years, will be there with you 10 years. We could provide some of those things that you care about. We are entering into a longer term partnership with you. That reduces the cost for both sides. That organization will be there. There are not too high costs for individual researchers. Some of the lessons that I've learned, I'm not saying they will work in all contexts. In my context also, like I work on large scale, like this public procurement project was 4 different ministries. So a lot of my gray hairs are because of like every day I had to do something to run the project, because some policymaker, the turnaround time is so quick. Every year there'll be a new secretary, there'll be a new person, so you have to work with them. So it's very high cost. But it's also like a call it a reputational mechanism. First time we were doing it was very costly. Eventually we established some credibility. So these are not consultants, they're not doing it for money. Yes, they want to publish, they have different incentives, and yes, they are producing something of value to us. Initially, many policymakers couldn't figure out, like, why is this guy coming to me? Like, why should I give him or her the data or other things? Slowly, gradually build some credibility through our work, either our work or the intermediary organization that we are working at university. For instance, Ditala University has wonderful students, it's known throughout the world. Your students will become policymakers tomorrow. Many of your students still maybe policymakers maybe come to for short-run courses, I'm sure. They'll be perfect partners because they will know the value of research and analysis. That's again something that we discovered in other contexts. Yeah, so I'm taking the question more less as a research, but more as in my policy positions. Policymakers often need to take decisions. They don't have the luxury of like waiting. Think COVID. So we can't wait for the results of research. We need to act now. But I think the challenge is thinking about policy not as a product or a one-shot transaction, but as a process. So acting based on whatever the best information that we have, that's what I think started out with. Charles Mansky, who is an economist, not mine, principles, is working with the best information that we have now, but also updating that information based on like, not just like you adopt a policy once for all time. Yes, right now there may be an urgency. In early days of COVID, yes, governments had to decide. We didn't know. There's not much information coming from epidemiologists, others. They took the safer course. But that doesn't mean that you can't update that course over time as you get more information. So thinking of policy as a process, not as a product. And constantly updating and course correcting it. You know, there is a Chinese saying, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And one comment on that is, You will only reach your destination if your step is in the right direction. But I disagree with that. So I'll say, so long as you have an error correction mechanism, it doesn't matter which direction you're going, so long as you can course correct. At every step that you see, you can course correct, and you can see whether you're going in the right direction. So it's a process, not a moment.
So we are on time now. If someone else has a question, we can take it. If not, thank you, Professor, so much for being here. I think that everyone that is in this audience believes in the relevance of data and information to make better policies and to make better decisions. You've given us a few good examples to push our view forward. Thank you so much, and thank you, Cecilia, also for helping us. Professor, today you're all very welcome to speak with Professor Khan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I very much hope next time I'll give the talk in Spanish.
Yeah.
I'm learning.